Hi, this is Max of Spaceship Villain, with the very first of our retrospective reviews, Star Fox for the Super Nintendo. I chose this game for our inaugural title because it's a significant landmark, which has been kind of overshadowed by later games in the series, and otherwise forgotten in a genre that has mostly faded away from this generation. Star Fox is a definite standout, remarkable in its day for revolutionary graphics and gameplay. Even today it's still significant as the start of a major Nintendo first-party franchise, and a key entry in the rail shooter genre. It's a game that I would have first played in 1993, when I was not even 10 years old. I remembered this game being amazing when I was young, but I also remember that I was never able to beat it. Going into this playthrough, I was intrigued to see whether I was just bad at video games when I was so much younger, or if it was still a legitimately hard game. What probably first got me looking at Star Fox again was a recent posting at Did You Know Gaming. Those are not silver boots. All spacecraft pilots in the Star Fox universe amputate their legs so that blood doesn't drain from their brain when they are under intense G-forces. Mandatory implantation of bionic legs indicates a really surprising depth of story lore that I would have never expected from a kid-friendly space shooter like Star Fox. I went back to official Nintendo promotional artwork and confirmed that this detail indeed showed up from the very beginning. It's such a strange element to include, but it's believable enough for science fiction. I wanted to give this series another look, to see if there is more of this inspired direction hidden behind its cartoon animal appeal. The story as it exists in the game itself is quite a bit lighter. An opening cinematic makes it clear that a planet is under attack, and the map screen will tell you that planet is Corneria. You get a line or two of mission text, letting you know you are to counterattack a planet called Venom, and that's about it. I guess it's fitting with the style of in-game storytelling at the time, but there's not really much information to go on. When you first get a game over screen, you'll see an ominous face appear, but do you even know who that is at this point in the game? If you owned and read the game's instruction manual, you would have found a written backstory and your teammates' portraits, but there are no pictures to associate this face with Andros. I know a lot of players tended to skip over these instructions anyway, so I guess that characterization was just to be inferred by the player. Visual performance is decent for the most part, but there are some times it becomes apparent that the 3D is trying to do more than the Super Nintendo hardware can keep up with. When you reach the end of each tunnel segment in the Space Armada, you trigger a sequence of explosions, and each of these quickly becomes an unplayable slideshow. Another unexpected point that bogs down the rendering noticeably is when you're running into something and it attempts to fill the screen with a single large surface. Perhaps that is something to do with the early approach to texture mapping, considering how little had been done with real-time 3D graphics up to this point. The polygon graphics, one of this game's strongest features when it debuted in 1993, do not hold up so well today, but intriguingly, they have not aged as poorly as several of the now eyesores from the N64, PS1 era. Nintendo was smart in making its first forays into polygon graphics, both with this and Stunt Race FX, represent mechanical entities. Whereas older, organic character models of Mario or Lara Croft may look embarrassing today, the R-Wings and their opponents are supposed to have sharp edges, and are still easily recognizable. Some confusion comes in when you're trying to compare objects' relative distance in the flat shading, though. There were several times I couldn't tell whether I needed to fly over or under an approaching obstacle. Sound design has fared much better. The music, which I only knew mostly from the Smash Bros. Soundtrack, is well composed and still enjoyable to listen to. The themes impart an appropriately space fantasy, militaristic feel to the levels, as needed. The sound effects are fine, the blaster noises have the right amount of weight, and the metallic clinks are quick to let you know which objects cannot be damaged. The digitized speech is a bit more questionable, and the bark text of your friendly co-pilots never quite seems to fit. But the gameplay is what matters anyway, and that holds up satisfyingly well. The flying is smooth, and the targeting tends towards the generous side of hit detection, and it is consistently fun to shoot down enemy fighters. There are two modes of control, first-person and third-person perspective, but neither is entirely satisfying. First person makes targeting easier, but it's hard to get a frame of reference for your ship to have any idea of what's going to hit you or not. Third person is easier to maneuver around obstacles, except when your craft is blocking your view, which happens too frequently in the claustrophobic tunnel segments. There is some nod to primitive, team-based AI, but your teammates are almost entirely decorative. There are 3 other pilots who will show up in levels from time to time, and it's almost always because they need to be rescued. The team play is fairly trivial, and you can safely ignore the AI if you like. In one instance, a teammate who I had saved only 15 seconds prior seemed to be joining me to assist in a boss fight, and I was thrilled. except then he flies around, takes a few pot shots at the horizon, and then leaves me to handle it myself. Okay, I guess I've got this. Of course, these useless characters still return to formation for each level's end cutscene, to fly away with their participant ribbons in tow. But it was a blast going through this game, refreshing my vague memories of the early levels and finally experiencing the rest of the game for myself. Particularly the iconic boss fight against Andross's polygonal face. This bit is interesting. Think about it. Did you ever actually play this level for yourself? Most players didn't. But if you remember this game, then I bet you remember this boss fight, even if you never actually saw it in person. I had never played it before, but I remembered it. It was all over my childhood. Star Fox was a pretty big title for Nintendo at the time, and this fight was one of its most visible marketing highlights. My friends and I had put together the entirety of this scene through Nintendo commercials on TV and Nintendo Power magazine at home. I know I had spent several of my younger hours recreating this scene in Mario Paint, using the templates from their strategy guide. So I'm glad to say I have finally played it for myself, after 20 years of hype. It's hard to view it as anything other than a crowning achievement of Nintendo's marketing machine, but like most of the boss fights, it's an interesting enemy that makes smart use of 3D. The regular level enemies may be fairly run-of-the-mill tanks or aircraft, but the boss fights are consistently impressive designs, with unexpected defenses that must be taken apart piece by piece. There's an interesting amount of interaction and engagement with the environment and the enemies throughout each level. On my first run through Stage 1, I was blindsided by towers falling on my R-Wing from out of frame. When I went back through later, I realized that I could shoot down these towers myself to remove them in advance of my arrival. Kind of grim for the residents of Corneria, but an interesting tactic. And seemingly innocent enemies can be taken out early before they go into attack formation, if you know to target them at that time. So it seems that this is not just an arcade game to be played as you go, but also a strategic game to be practiced and improved. A straight-through completion run is possible in just under 2 hours with no continues, but a more realistic estimate would probably put several hours just into playing and replaying those first few levels to get you up to the more difficult latter half. In some ways, it feels like this is one of those games designed to be hoarded, one of the only handful of games you might own as a child. Every weekend you could pick it up again, building on past experience to blaze through those levels you had mastered, and get that little bit further into the highest level you had yet achieved. At a certain point in my own playthrough, however, I reached a noticeable limit of the involvement I wanted from this experience, and was unwilling to invest much more. I wasn't looking for a challenge. I wanted to complete the game within a single session and be done with it. I had progressed from dumbly running into large buildings in level 1 to the thrill of weaving in and out between crisscrossing obstacles in level 6, and I loved that piece of the experience. But I was no longer willing to go through the introductory levels over again, just to get another attempt at that last boss fight. I've never understood why I'm supposed to enjoy losing to the same attacks over and over again, just so I can finally recognize the pattern. I'm sure that's a satisfying experience if you are of that mindset, but unfortunately I'm past the point in my gaming life where I find that worthwhile. So I had to save and reload continually just to get through the boss fights, and that part felt like a grind. I still loved the majority of the experience. Flying through a level, shooting down air and land-based enemies was fantastic, and I really enjoyed finally seeing the rest of the game I had made so many futile attempts at as a child. But the difficulty of the boss fights still felt cheap to me, and those portions were difficult to get through, both for the skill required and in summoning the motivation to continue. But, all things considered, I would definitely recommend going back to the original. If you're a person who likes the Star Fox franchise but got into it a bit later, you'll quickly find yourself forgetting about the poly count and having a great time with it. But some elements of its design come from an older school of thought, and it's definitely not for everyone. If you enjoy challenging gameplay, and the rail shooter genre in particular, you owe it to yourself to check out this title. Even if you're on the fence or just curious about how the franchise got its roots, I'd still give it a shot, but either play it just for fun without any commitment, or at least don't attempt to rush through it in one sitting. Now, what do you think? Was this game as hard as you remembered, or were you one of those people who was fighting Andross as far back as the early 90s? Were the graphics too old for you to enjoy, or do you worry that too much realism might look like Miyamoto's terrifying puppets? There was a ton of stuff I didn't even have time to get into here, like the branches of the map, or the secret level where you learn clues about your main character's father. I still wonder why Nintendo remade Star Fox 64 for the 3DS, instead of going back to this, the series original. So let me know what you think. Join in on the discussion on any of these topics, your own memories of the game, or surprises you may have found during a recent playthrough of your own. So that was my review of Star Fox for the Super Nintendo. Since that was the first episode of Retrospective Reviews, I would love to hear how you liked it or what we could do better. I'll post a list of games we're considering doing for our next reviews on spaceshipvillain.com, and if you guys are interested, I can try and get a poll online so you can vote for which ones you want to see. Take a look at the links in the description for more information on both Star Fox and Spaceship Villain, and please check out our games on Kongregate. Once again, this has been Max from Spaceship Villain, and I hope you've enjoyed the first episode of Retrospective Reviews.